In this conversation, Thomas speaks with Thomas Swimme about a millennial impulse deep in the religious fabric of the West. He traces this millennial drive to the book of Revelation, the last book of the Christian Bible, where John describes his visions of a future paradise, 1,000 years of peace, justice, and plenty, in which the human condition would be surmounted. For Thomas, such a promise has offered an enduring sense of expectation and hope within Western history. This took root especially in Russia, where the suffering brought on by the Tartar invasions of the 13th century was met with a hopeful sense for the second coming of Christ. Centuries later in the Soviet Union, Thomas suggests that a millennial vision fueled the rise of communism with its salvific power. In late medieval Europe, Thomas describes how the Black Death exposed the harshness of nature, encouraging people to seek spiritual solace in an escape from a suffering world. But this orientation was later reversed in the Enlightenment period, where through modern science the focus shifted from escaping this world to dealing with life's hardships directly through human ingenuity. In other words, the millennial vision was transformed into what Barry calls a wonder world vision, to be achieved through the control of science over nature. For Thomas, modern science is itself a visionary venture, driven by a millennial longing for a future paradise above and beyond the human condition. He compares modern industrialism to a whirlwind, and like a whirlwind, it can reach great power before its inevitable collapse. There is a set limit on things, he says, but our industrial way of life has disregarded this reality with its total contempt for the earth. Thomas leaves us with the question, what is the great vision we will follow in our own times? Will we place our energies in a Technozoic era of human control over nature, or give birth to an Ecozoic era of human earth flourishing?
Thomas, when you think in terms of these discontinuities that have governed, in a certain sense, Western tradition, there's still this question of what really is dynamiting this drive, because we're not just thinking of ourselves as superior to or transcendent to the natural world. We're just ripping apart, as you're describing it. We're just tearing apart the forest, and we're just ripping apart the petroleum. It seems to be more than just providing for humans. There seems to be more going on.
Oh, definitely. And it comes back to the reason why is Western civilization so powerful. There are many reasons. This focus on the human is basic to it. But it's deep in the religious dynamic of Western civilization. Because there was a promise at the end of the Bible, in fact, it's the last pages of the Bible, of the Apocalypse of St. John, called the Book of Revelations. And this was John's effort to give to the Christian people some sense of the future and of the tensions that would exist and the strife that Christians would be going through. And for a while, the Christians thought that history was coming to an end, that the Messiah had come, and that there would be a very wonderful future, because the signs of the Messiah was that there would emerge a period of peace and justice and abundance would come in the Messianic period. But the Messiah came, supposedly, but it was nothing happened. The world went on the same, and there was the persecution and difficulty and all that. And so John went to Patmos. It was an island in the Aegean Sea, and supposedly in a cave there, he wrote this book of Revelations, which he described the visions that he had. And in chapters 17 to 22, he describes the woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, crowned with 12 stars, and who brought forth a child. and the dragon sought to kill the child. And the tension of history is described in the tension between the woman and the dragon. And there was to come a time, and this is the great promise, and this may be the most powerful element in human history, and certainly one of the most powerful determinants in the total course of the planet Earth. It's the promise that there would come a time when the dragon would be chained for 1,000 years, and there would be peace and justice, abundance. The human condition would be surmounted. The real difficulty that we're dealing with here has to do with what you might call the human condition. And humans are finding problems in how to manage life in some kind of way where they could avoid the pain and difficulty and stress and the miseries of life that they come with being human. There's an awful lot of misery in the human order. And all peoples long to manage. That's why we develop deep spiritual life, is in order to manage psychically the burdens of existence. And we feel them much more than the non-intellectual world or the less intellectual world. We're so sensitized to it. So the whole promise of peace, the day of the Lord in the Bible, culminates in this sense of there would be 1,000 years. And then after the 1,000 years would be the end of time. The earthly Jerusalem, which is the community of the faithful, would be transferred to paradise or to a trans-earthly realm, and the world as we know it would some manner disappear. This promise of 1,000 years was in the Western mind. That gave a direction, that gave a dynamism to Western history. And one of the strong things about it, and we'll be faced with this now in the year 2000, that the year 1000, people thought that maybe this end of the year 1000 was a critical moment. Maybe this was the end of history because the end of 1,000 years. And undoubtedly there will be people the year 2000 will wonder about what was happening in the year 1000. A lot of people became extravagant, and they predicted the earthquakes, and the things that happened then were interpreted in this context. But what happened with this promise of 1,000 years is that it gave the Western world historical dynamism. It gave them an expectation, a hope, something to look forward to within history. There was always this question of beatitude in a post-historical mode. Western civilization has been driven by this promise, and it showed up particularly in the Russian world. And we can discuss how to interpret the book of Revelations. But one thing is certain, it had its most powerful impact in Russia. Russia, and particularly after the Russians endured the Tatar dominance for over 200 years, Russia was evangelized from Byzantium, not the Roman Christianity, but Eastern Christianity, and these two have gone different paths. Now, this sense of the millennium meant a great deal because although Russia, with its capital in Kiev, was evangelized in around the 10th, 11th century, when the Mongols came through. Subutai came through, was the Western general of Genghis Khan. He came into Budapest in something like 1242. So the Mongol invasion was a very powerful phase in the whole of Eurasian history. The dominance of the invading forces continued until around 1480, for over 200 years, and it was the period when the suffering was so great that it's sometimes said that that's when the severity entered into the Russian soul, sometimes what they call the endurance of the Russians. And then, but the hope came, and that's why in the empire, they took over the heritage of the Eastern Roman Empire, and that's where the word Tsar comes from, Caesar. So that it continues that tradition. But they developed the idea that the second coming of Christ would come in Russia, in the Soviet. And they looked forward particularly, because they suffered so much, they looked forward particularly to the Millennial age. Russia had no medieval period, it had no Renaissance period, no medieval period, no Renaissance period. It went directly into the period of modern enlightenment, and from the French world in the 18th century. So they moved from a very early phase of cultural development, or that type of cultural development that existed earlier in the history of Europe, directly into a modern world. It gives them their power, it gives them many things. But one thing that it gave them was this quest for the millennium. And that's why communism was so powerful, because the salvation of the world comes from Russia, because the Philotheus in the 1500s, around 1530, gave off the interpretation of history, the movement in terms of the three movements, or the three centers of Christian salvation. The first center was in Rome, and then there was an explanation that the first Rome failed, and the center moved to Constantinople. The Constantinople failed because they had a reconciliation with the Western world, which represented a failure. But two Romes have fallen, the third Rome stands, and then after the failure of Constantinople, the center of salvation shifted to Moscow. And the Philotheus says, two Romes have fallen, third Rome stands, there'll be no fourth. So that this has been in the Soviet mind. This is that millennial vision. This is that salvation experience that comes into the order of time as well as eternity. So that through the millennium, the salvation is to come not simply in an eternal context, but in a temporal context. Now, that's the way it went in the Soviet world. What's very fascinating is that this millennial vision dynamized both Soviet communism. When communism came, it took on all this dynamism of salvation for the world. And Marx, everybody thought communism would come in the most industrial age, because it was alive with the socialism that arose out of industrial context. And so it was totally against the interpretation of communism, 19th century communism, that communism would come primarily in the Soviet world or in the Russian world. Now, in the West, it took a different course. In the West, after the plague, in 1347 to 1349, the Black Death struck Europe. a third of the people died. The Black Death was a terrible affliction all the way from China through the Middle East and the West. In China, the population declined from something over 110 million to 70 million. In the West, it came later, a century or so later, but almost a third of the people died. In the West, they had no theory of germs, so they figured that the world had grown wicked. God was punishing the world, and the best thing to do was to get spiritual and be redeemed out of the world. So, in the Western world, the answer was to become spiritual in the face of the difficulties of life. And this gave rise in the 15th century. The art changed. In the 14th century of Giotto's naturalism, there were the introduction of judgment scenes, or the introduction of human decadence, and preaching changed to spiritual redemption orientations, alienation from the world. The world was not a desirable place to be. So that went on up through the 15th century. You had the dance of death, the ars moriendi, the art of dying. These were powerful forces throughout the 15th century, prepared the way in the 16th century, when the Reformation took place, and this Puritanism comes in, back to the simplicity of the gospel. All of this gorgeous liturgy is vanity and pagan. Therefore, you had to go back to the Bible, all the rationalization. There was an attack on the rationalization of the medieval scholasticism. All of this is vanity. And so the world became looked at as a kind of vanity. The thing to do is to get alienated from it. But this was a severe answer. So what happened was that the new science came in. Copernicus rethought the whole macrophase structure of the universe. You get people like, who was the scientist that figured out the ecliptic and so forth?
Kepler.
Kepler comes into the picture. And then you get also into, well, Galileo comes in, and you get to new mathematics with calculus, I believe. Newton was involved with that. But you have the new science comes in, but then Francis Bacon is the coordinator of the whole business. And he says that we deal with the difficulties of life not by getting away from life, not by salvation answer or looking at things at vanity, but you learn how to control nature. You torture nature to give up its secrets so that you can control nature and you can deal with life. And gradually, the millennial vision was transformed into wonder world vision to be achieved by human technologists, science, and controls over the natural world. Now, it's clear, it's totally clear, that the drive of modern science is non-scientific. There's nothing scientific about the drive of modern science. There's nothing technological about the technological drive. They're both visionary. They both are looking for the millennial achievement. America was founded on the idea of getting away from the destruction of Europe, from the devastation, from the corruption, into a pure world, into a good world, into a controlled world, into a wonder world. So you can trace both our drive at the present time And the episode that, 70 years I've lived through, the total of the Soviet thing, it came in 1917 when I was 3 years old. The Soviet experiment disappeared in the early 90s, 91, I believe. It's very recent. And it didn't last for a lot of reasons. And that's the difficulty of the Soviet, is to cover a mystique of itself. It's not simply a political problem. It's a problem of replacing a great vision. And so the Soviet, and Russia particularly, has to have, I think, a great vision, just like America has to have.
And so now the great vision that they are pursuing would be the millennial drive in the technological consumer culture.
That is in America. Now, whether this can support the Soviet is another thing. And whether this can be transplanted, this is being transplanted into the whole human world, you might say, in terms of this vision of moving people from their poverty and their lack of control over things into this global economy. You absorb them into the global economy. And the global economy gets driven by electronics and chemistry and, again, petroleum. And it's going to last a brief while. I once described at a meeting in Mexico, about 2, possibly 3 years ago. It's a meeting on technology and the future of Mexico. It was one of the most elaborate conferences I was ever at in terms of all the electronics. It cost $1,000 to attend this conference. Some 200-some people came. You had 15 people talking about the international world of Mexico and then the inner structure of Mexico and so forth. But it was before the GATT treaties came in and the International Trade Organization. But this was being discussed and all that. And my proposal there was that we solve our local problems by going to another level, to a regional basis, to, say, a state basis, to a nation basis, to a multi-nation basis, to a trans-nation basis, to a global basis. But once you get to this higher level, once you get to you can't go anywhere else. So my proposal is the globalization will lead to a whirlwind of production and trade. But like every whirlwind, it'll be wonderful for a while, or it will have a great deal of power for a while, and then it'll suddenly collapse. And there won't be anything because there's a set limit on things. The set limit is the planet Earth. And we have just total contempt for the planet Earth.